The rain drummed against the 42nd floor windows of the Rainier Tower, each drop catching the gray Seattle light before sliding down the glass like tears. I sat at the polished mahogany conference table, my hands folded in front of me, watching the city I'd called home for 28 years stretch out below. The Space Needle stood defiant in the distance, a reminder that some things endure despite the constant push for reinvention. My name is Thomas Anderson, and at 57 I've seen this tech company grow from a scrappy startup in a Bellevue garage to a Fortune 500 powerhouse with offices spanning 3 continents. I was employee number 47, back when we celebrated landing a $10,000 contract and everyone knew everyone's birthday. Now we employ over 15,000 people, and I barely recognize the company I helped build. The boardroom buzzed with the energy of quarterly reviews and strategic planning. Laptops glowed like modern campfires around the table, their screens reflecting the faces of executives who spoke in acronyms and measured success in metrics I was still learning to understand. The coffee in my ceramic mug had gone cold an hour ago, but I held on to it anyway, finding comfort in its familiar weight. Today was supposed to be different. Today, I was presenting the results of Project Meridian, a client integration system my team had spent 18 months developing. The same system that had just increased client retention by 43% and saved the company $2.8 million in operational costs. Today should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like a trial. The meeting had started routinely enough. Quarterly reports, budget allocations, the usual corporate choreography I'd participated in hundreds of times before. But there was tension in the air, the kind that precedes a storm. I could feel it in the way conversations stopped when I entered the room, in the sideways glances from executives who used to seek my advice. At the head of the table sat Brandon Walsh, our new Chief Technology Officer. At 31, Brandon embodied everything Silicon Valley valued: Stanford PhD, venture capital connections, and the kind of disruptive thinking that made board members salivate. He'd been hired 6 months ago with a mandate to modernize our technological infrastructure and optimize human capital allocation. I'd tried to work with him, really tried. When he suggested implementing agile methodologies, I adapted my project management style. When he proposed restructuring our development teams, I supported the initiative. But there was always an undercurrent of dismissal in our interactions, a subtle suggestion that my decades of experience were somehow incompatible with his vision of the future. "Thomas," Brandon said, his voice cutting through my thoughts like a blade, "I understand you're here to present the Meridian results." I straightened in my chair, pulling up the presentation I'd spent weeks perfecting. Yes, the numbers are quite impressive. Client retention is up 43%. Operational costs are down significantly, and user satisfaction scores— "Let me stop you there," Brandon interrupted, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "While I'm sure the numbers look good on paper, I think we need to discuss the elephant in the room." The conference room fell silent. Around the table, I could see faces turning toward us with the anticipation of spectators at a sporting event. My team members, Sarah, Miguel, and David, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "The elephant?" I asked, though something in my gut already knew where this was heading. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his expression a carefully calibrated mixture of professionalism and condescension. "The fundamental question of whether traditional approaches can meet the demands of modern technology." "Traditional approaches?" I repeated, feeling the weight of 28 years suddenly pressing down on my shoulders. "Brandon, the Meridian system is cutting-edge technology. We implemented machine learning algorithms, cloud-native architecture, and real-time analytics that built on outdated frameworks." Brandon cut me off, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never seen a project fail. "Thomas, I've reviewed your code. It's functional, certainly, but it lacks the elegance, the innovation that our clients expect from a forward-thinking company." The words hit like physical blows. Around the table, I could see executives nodding thoughtfully, as if Brandon had just revealed some profound truth. My team members looked stunned, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger and disbelief. "The system works," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "It exceeds every performance metric we established. Client feedback has been overwhelmingly positive." Brandon smiled, the kind of smile that could sell ice to Eskimos. "And that's exactly the problem, Thomas. You're satisfied with works. We need systems that don't just function, We need systems that inspire, that push boundaries, that represent the future of our industry. He stood up, walking around the table with the confidence of a prosecutor addressing a jury. The truth is, your approach represents everything that's holding us back. You think in terms of stability and incremental improvement, but this industry demands disruption, innovation, revolutionary thinking. I could feel my heart pounding, my hands growing damp. This wasn't just professional criticism, this was character assassination disguised as strategic vision. Furthermore, Brandon continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an inevitable verdict, I think it's time we address the fundamental question. Can someone with your background really understand the needs of our millennial and Gen Z client base? The implication hung in the air like smoke. My background, my age, my irrelevance. Experience has value, I said quietly, my voice carrying 3 decades of earned authority. The lessons learned from past projects, the wisdom gained from seeing technologies rise and fall. Brandon's laugh was sharp, cutting. Experience? Thomas, in this industry, experience is just another word for obsolete. The word obsolete echoed in my mind like a death knell. I sat there feeling every year, every gray hair, every line on my face. Was this how it ended? Not with recognition or gratitude, but with dismissal and irrelevance? I thought about my wife, Linda, waiting at home with dinner plans and stories about her day at the nonprofit where she worked with senior citizens. I thought about my daughter, Jessica, who still called me for advice about her own tech startup despite having graduated from MIT with honors. I thought about all the young developers I'd mentored over the years, the systems I'd built that still ran critical operations, the innovations I'd pioneered that had become industry standards. You know what your real problem is, Thomas? Brandon continued, his voice softer now but no less cutting. You're stuck in the past. You think because something worked 5 years ago, it'll work today. But technology moves at the speed of light, and frankly, you're moving at the speed of, well, experience. The room was completely silent now. I could hear the rain against the windows, the distant hum of traffic 42 floors below, the soft whir of laptops processing the digital destruction of my career. Let me be clear, Brandon said, returning to his seat with the satisfaction of someone who knew he held all the cards. The Meridian project, while functional, represents everything we need to move away from. Slow development cycles, conservative architecture choices, risk-averse thinking. It's time for this company to embrace the future instead of being anchored to the past. I glanced at my team members. Sarah, 28, brilliant and fiercely loyal. Miguel, 35, a coding genius who could solve problems others couldn't even identify. David, 26, fresh out of Carnegie Mellon, with ideas that challenged even my experienced perspective. They'd worked 18 months on Meridian, pouring their creativity and expertise into every line of code. The bottom line, Brandon concluded, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel, is that experience means nothing here. What matters is innovation, disruption, the ability to think beyond the limitations of conventional wisdom. He paused, looking directly at me. And frankly, Thomas, that's just not who you are anymore. Brandon stood up again, this time with the theatrical flair of someone who knew he had an audience. In fact, he said, his voice rising with confidence, I think Thomas's presentation today perfectly illustrates the generational divide that's holding our industry back. He began walking around the table again, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the polished floor. Here we have a veteran developer, someone who's been coding since before the internet was mainstream, trying to convince us that his methodical, traditional approach is somehow revolutionary. A few executives chuckled, the sound cutting through me like broken glass. I could see phones being discreetly raised, people recording this moment for internal Slack channels and industry gossip networks. The beautiful thing about technology, Brandon continued, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight, is that it's a pure meritocracy. Code either works efficiently or it doesn't. Systems either scale elegantly or they don't. Innovation either pushes boundaries or it maintains the status quo. More nods around the table. Faces that had once sought my guidance now wore expressions of polite agreement with Brandon's assessment. The Meridian project, my team's 18 months of dedication, my 28 years of service, all of it seemed to evaporate in the face of this public dismantling. And the harsh reality, Brandon said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering necessary medicine. is that experience in our rapidly evolving field often becomes a liability. It creates attachment to outdated methods, resistance to change, an inability to think outside established paradigms. He gestured toward me with the casual dismissiveness of someone swatting away a fly. Thomas represents the old guard, dedicated certainly, hardworking, absolutely, but fundamentally incompatible with the speed and innovation our clients demand. The silence was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room on me, waiting to see how I'd respond to this systematic destruction of my professional identity. "So here's what I propose," Brandon announced, his voice carrying the authority of inevitable change. "Let's give Thomas a round of applause for his years of service, and then let's move forward with a development strategy that actually reflects the realities of modern technology." He began clapping, slow and deliberate, the sound echoing off the glass walls like gunshots. Around the table, I watched as executives began to join in, their applause building into a crescendo of professional dismissal. But then something extraordinary happened. In the corner where my team sat, there was only silence. The applause continued around the table, but the silence from my team's corner was deafening. Sarah, Miguel, and David sat with their hands folded, their faces set in expressions of quiet defiance. The contrast was stark. Executives clapping for my dismissal, while the people who actually worked with me refused to participate in my humiliation. Brandon noticed the silence, and his confident expression faltered slightly. "Sarah, Miguel, David," he said, his voice carrying a note of expectation. "I'm sure you appreciate the opportunity to work with more contemporary leadership going forward." Sarah Chen stood up slowly, her slight frame somehow commanding the attention of the entire room. At 28, she was one of the most talented developers I'd ever worked with, and in that moment, she looked like she was preparing for battle. "Actually, Brandon," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I think you're wrong." The applause died instantly. The room fell silent except for the rain against the windows and the soft hum of electronics. Brandon's face went through a spectrum of emotions: surprise, confusion, and then something approaching anger. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice tight with controlled irritation. "You said experience means nothing here," Sarah continued, stepping forward with the kind of courage that comes from absolute conviction. "But you're wrong. Experience means everything." Miguel stood up next, his tall frame unfolding like a tree reaching toward sunlight. "Thomas didn't just teach us to code," he said, his slight accent making his words even more powerful. "He taught us to think, to solve problems that don't have obvious solutions, to build systems that last." David joined them, his young face serious beyond his years. "The Meridian Project isn't just functional," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It's elegant, it's innovative, it's everything you claim to value, built on a foundation of experience you're too arrogant to recognize." Brandon's face was reddening now, his carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble. "This is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with passion. "Is watching someone dismiss a man who has forgotten more about software development than most of us will ever learn. Thomas doesn't just write code, he crafts solutions. He doesn't just manage projects, he mentors people." She turned to address the entire room now, her voice carrying the conviction of absolute truth. "You want to know about innovation? Thomas was implementing machine learning algorithms when most of you thought AI was science fiction. You want to talk about disruption? He built the core systems that this company still runs on today." Miguel stepped forward, his voice adding weight to Sarah's words. "The Meridian Project succeeded because Thomas taught us to balance innovation with stability, creativity with reliability. He showed us that true disruption isn't about throwing away everything that came before. It's about building something better on a foundation of wisdom." David's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "You mock his experience, but that experience is why our code works, why our systems scale, why our clients trust us. Thomas didn't just teach us programming languages, he taught us the language of excellence." The three of them stood together, facing down a room full of executives and a CTO whose authority was suddenly looking very fragile. "So no," Sarah concluded, her voice steady as granite, "we won't applaud the dismissal of the best mentor we've ever had. Experience doesn't mean nothing here. Experience means everything." The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Around the table, I could see faces that had been nodding in agreement with Brandon now looking uncertain, even ashamed. The executives who had been applauding my dismissal suddenly found their laptops fascinating, unable to meet my eyes or those of my team. Brandon sat down heavily, his face pale and his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The theatrical authority was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. He'd expected compliance, agreement, the easy dismissal of an outdated employee. Instead, he'd encountered something he clearly hadn't prepared for: loyalty born from respect. Brandon began, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked his age, young, uncertain, and suddenly very aware that his Stanford PhD hadn't prepared him for this moment. Margaret Foster, our CEO, stepped forward from her position at the head of the table. At 54, she'd built her reputation on recognizing talent and fostering innovation. Her expression was unreadable, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of final authority. "Brandon," she said quietly, "I think we need to discuss your understanding of what makes this company successful." The words hung in the air like a judgment. I could see Brandon's face go through a spectrum of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and finally, something that might have been genuine realization. I stood up slowly, looking at my team, these brilliant young people who had just risked their own careers to defend mine. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Miguel's jaw was set with determination, and David looked like he was ready to take on the world. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice carrying 3 decades of gratitude. Sarah smiled, the same smile that had lit up our team meetings and late-night debugging sessions. "You taught us that loyalty isn't just about code or contracts. It's about standing up for what's right." As the meeting dissolved around us, I realized that Brandon had been wrong about one fundamental thing. Experience wasn't obsolete. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. And sometimes, that foundation was strong enough to hold up the people who mattered most. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt undervalued because of your experience or witnessed someone stand up for what's right in the face of authority, please share this video. Sometimes the most powerful moments in our careers come not from individual achievements, but from the loyalty and courage of those who choose to stand with us. Subscribe for more stories that remind us that true leadership isn't about dismissing experience. It's about recognizing its value and building upon it. Remember, in a world obsessed with the next big thing, sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to applaud when wisdom is dismissed.